The following presentation was recorded at the 2013 SouthEast LinuxFest in Charlotte, North Carolina. It is licensed under a Creative Commons license. For more information about the SouthEast LinuxFest, visit www.southeastlinuxfest.org. The SouthEast LinuxFest would like to thank the following diamond sponsors in 2013 for helping make these videos possible.
So I'm here to talk about military open source software. My name is Winston Messer. In my day job hat, I work for Georgia Tech as a researcher. But what I'm talking about today is this group Mil-OSS that I've been working with for the past 3 or so years. Currently, I'm the chairman of the steering committee. I say currently because that's a position with very short term limits, and I've only been doing it for about a couple months, so I'm really new to it. Usual disclaimers apply. I have a ton of slides. Death by PowerPoint is really real. I can't tell you what the symptoms are, but you'll know if you have them. So be careful, somebody could get hurt. And before we get too far into it, because we know in the open source community there's about 1 million definitions of what open source means, and some of them are open source friendly definitions where it's more like free software, and some of them just mean here's the source code, don't touch it, don't use it, don't redistribute it. So when talking about open source within the Department of Defense, this is the official DoD definition of open source software. It's software where the human readable source code is available for use, study, reuse, modification, enhancement, and redistribution by the users of that software. So immediately, 2 really cool things are visible. One is that that definition is 100% compatible with the Free Software Foundation's definition of open source. And second, that it is also 100% compatible with the Open Source Initiative's OSD, open source definition. DoD always uses open source software spelled out or the abbreviation OSS, all caps. They don't hyphenate open source, which isn't useful information, but the more you know. So here's who Mil-OSS is, and this is a slide that I copied from our website. We're a grassroots organization of people connecting open source with the Department of Defense. Most of our members work for or with the DoD either directly or as contractors, and see our work in open source as patriotic contributions supporting our nation's warfighters. A little bit of history. Mil-OSS got started in 2003 when a researcher was working with a Marine trying to find how they could release one of their projects as open source, and nobody really had a great idea on how to do that. And as that conversation sort of expanded and starting to include more and more people who were really good at policy and really good at open source, those guys got together and started the organization. 2008 was really our big landmark year for us. We had our first working group, which is our version of something sort of like a conference, not dissimilar from this. And also Mil-OSS joined Open Source for America as one of its working groups. And we've been working with OSFA since then. This is our mission statement. It's a direct copy paste from the website. I'm not going to read this to you. I did provide it helpfully though, if you want to read it to yourself. But the bottom line is that we want Mil-OSS to help the government make better use of taxpayer dollars and to use open source principles and technologies to make our military safer and make America safer. These goals hopefully are clear. They follow directly from our mission statement. But we're trying to create new open source and create new opportunities for open source within DoD. I'm gonna step out so I can actually see it. We're going to increase code reuse so that we're not reinventing the wheel every time that we need a particular capability, and increase awareness of open source code that's reusable to make it less likely that we reinvent the wheel over and over and over again. And then we want to create new events and opportunities to enable that kind of collaboration. And one of those is our mailing list, which I encourage you all to get on. That's where the real magic of Mil-OSS happens. It's just a bunch of guys talking about open source and military and how we can make chocolate and peanut butter, 2 great tastes, taste great together. And then another big way that we do that is our annual working group, which I'll tell you about in a little bit later. The last step, improved collaboration with our allies, actually became much more a forefront of what we're doing this year when the first non-US Mil-OSS group was started. A group in Israel copied our model and sort of established themselves as a chapter of this same style of thinking. So now we're starting to get a little bit preachy, and I'm sorry, but I am going to preach at you guys a little bit. These are sort of the big beliefs of Mil-OSS. We find that contributing to OSS is a patriotic thing that we can do to help make America safer. And that when we are trusted with taxpayer dollars, we have to make absolutely the best use of that we possibly can, so that we, the people, don't get ripped off, and so that we can stretch those dollars as far as we can and get the best bang for the buck. And we believe that the only thing more innovative than people is lots of people working together, and that's what we do. And then we believe that problems need solving, and that a real problem that's solved right will find the funding that it needs to find. So, military and open source. Open source is a really new concept, and introducing it to the military, it takes a little bit of time to change. Anytime you have a large organization, especially an older organization, there's a lot of inertia, of resistance to change. The US military employs upwards of 3 million people, and we've had a military longer than we've had a constitution, so it very obviously meets the definition of both old and large. So it takes a little while to get them up to speed. One nice thing, though, is the military has been around long enough to understand some problems really, really well. So in computer science, when we have a problem we don't know how to solve, we reduce it to a problem we do know how to solve, or a collection of problems we do know how to solve. So what problem is the military really great at solving? It's going to be guns, because it's America, and that's what we do really, really well. So we talk about what software can learn from guns and what developers can learn from guns to make their software better and work better in the military application. So the first question is, why should software follow guns? So the military has been using guns since a year that starts with 17, and they've been buying software, at least something we would recognize as modern computer software, only since the 40s or 50s. And open source is a really new concept by comparison to either of those. The other reason is that the military has found a solution that works really well for their guns, and that solution is open source. The vast majority of individual weapons issued by the US military are open source, either because the patents have expired long ago or because the military is the owner of the specification. So I'm talking about guns being open source. I'm talking about M16s, M4s, M9s, 1911s, and M11s, and really other things that I haven't thought to include on the notes as well. Some of those because their patents have expired, the M4 because the government recently acquired this specification, and then the patents expired after that. Guns also have some advantages just by their nature of being physical items that make them a little bit easier to think of in open source terms than software. So if I have a gun, it's not that hard for me to take it apart, look at it, find out how it works, understand it, identify a part that I think is a problem, build a better part for it, and then distribute that part. And the manufacturers really don't have much of a problem with that. But when you do the same thing with software, the manufacturers lose their minds because they're forever trying to find ways to say, oh no, you can't decompile this, you can't modify it, you can't see the code, and by no means can you redistribute even an add-on for the code. And I mean, there's an obvious difference in that with guns, if I distribute a gun to you, I don't have it anymore because it's a physical item. So like you can either have part and I can have part, or one of us has the whole thing, but it's not something like software where if I give you a copy, I still have a copy. But really that difference doesn't explain quite enough of the complete mindset shift between the two. So to jump gears a little bit, these are 4 benefits of open source, and I'm going to talk about each of them and how we can learn from guns in how we use them. Originally, when I made this slide, I made a joke that I either found these as a survey's results or made them up myself. At the time, I remembered which, but now I really am going to have to leave that as an exercise for the reader. But they should be things we're all familiar with of working with open source, and I'll talk about them one at a time. Starting with security. So a lot of people like to talk about open source for security reasons, and probably most of us could give an entire hour-long talk just about the security benefits of open source. It's been beaten to death, and a lot of people love to talk about it. There's also a slowly prevailing opinion, including in government, that open source is the right way to do security or the only way to do security, because how can you trust something you don't understand, and how can you understand code that you can't see? And I agree with that absolutely. And that's why, like, NIST understands that really well. That's why when NIST describes a new specification for a cryptographic algorithm, it's always done in public. It's always done as part of a public process where people can comment on it and show their own version of it and how there might be a problem with this or something might be right with it. It's also why you don't ever see proprietary cryptographic algorithms. People on computers or phones throw a Google on proprietary cryptographic algorithm and look at how many hits you have to go through before you find somebody saying something good about one. I tried it yesterday, and it took 2 pages worth of hits before I found somebody saying something that wasn't negative about the idea of using proprietary crypto. And the thing that they were saying that wasn't negative was that RC4 is proprietary, which isn't really a value statement, more just an objective fact. Another objective fact is that RC4 is cracked and is the reason that your neighbor's web-protected Wi-Fi is why you can't keep your kids from getting around your parental controls, because it's just a wide open door next door. So I'll say, I do think that open source is definitely the right way to do software and the right way to do security. But all that said, if you're considering an open source solution, it's important that it be secure, and open source does not guarantee security. And if you're considering an insecure option, even if it's because it's open source, then you're wrong, and you're part of the problem, so unplug and go home. We don't need you. Because if the software is not secure, you can't be trusted, and certainly not in a production environment, especially not when dollars are on the line, and especially not when lives are on the line. I have sort of similar thoughts about cost. So we love to say open source greatly improves your TCO, and it generally does, and almost always. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that you should go with the solution just because it's cheaper or just because it's open source. So if Colt wants to sell me that thing, which looks really useful, and some guy on SourceForge with a self-deprecating username wants to sell me an axe at a greatly reduced price, I really have to consider which one fits my mission objectives better. Because if I'm cutting down trees, I know which one I want. But if it's combat, it's not going to be the same one. Is it the same one for you?
Have you ever tried to cut down a tree with AR-15?
I've seen it done with a shotgun.
It's a lot less sweaty.
Right.
So you're saying ease of use takes,
But it is more expensive.
there's also an increased distance.
But if you're in the military, who cares about the expense?
Exactly. Thank you for being here.
So the other thing is I think we can also imagine the opposite use case. We can all imagine a situation where in the right hands, that axe works better in combat than that rifle. So I'm picturing maybe Jackie Chan in a super enclosed room where nobody can really get the distance to shoot and he can just wail on them. And with open source, a lot of times, open source nerds, including developers, we like to think of ourselves in that ninja role where we're like, yeah, absolutely, this software works a lot better. My example, I love Thunderbird. It's my favorite email client. But when I show it to somebody in the next office over and say, hey, yeah, check this out, this is great. And they're like, oh, that looks like it's not as pretty or as full-featured as Outlook. And I'm like, well, no, I mean, not out of the box, but when you got these 6 add-ons that I'm using and this custom theme and all this customizations that I've done, it works way better. But then I'm thinking like the guy that can use the axe successfully instead of the guy that needs the gun and the training with the gun. So we have to think in terms of our end users, not in terms of ourselves or of a perfect use case. So if the military wants to acquire a whole ton of those axes and send them into combat, it may be cheaper up front, but then they're going to spend a bunch of money turning them into rifles first. And I bet the process to turn an axe into a rifle is more expensive than the process to buy a rifle. Although I can also think of use cases where it wouldn't be. But that's not the point. But all that said, open source generally does improve your TCO, but TCO is the target that you're trying to reduce, not the upfront cost. What does it cost to use successfully to complete your missions with the finances that you have available? Ease of customization is probably my favorite feature of open source personally. Certainly has benefited me a lot where I need a capability and either I can't afford to go buy that capability or I can't buy it because nobody's done it yet. But what I can find is an open source project that gets me really close. I can acquire that code, add the capability to it, and now I have the capability for very little cost and very little effort. And that works great when you're in R&D, but if you're in production, you're not going to buy 600,000 fixer-uppers and send them into combat, because it'd be the axe thing again, and that's how people get hurt. Well, so vendor lock-in is something I love to harp on. because there's really no downside to getting rid of vendor lock-in. Vendor lock-in is bad because once you're locked in, it's really hard to get out, and it's really hard to get out cheaply. But it's also a security problem, because if you're locked in to a proprietary solution, and then the vendor quits, files Chapter 7, quits making that product, whatever, and you can't get rid of that product, who's making the security patches for you? If you don't have the code, it's not you. And if the vendor's not doing it, it's not anybody. And so now you have a vulnerable thing on your network getting you into trouble. So the military has this problem, and they have this problem with guns as well. And the solution they found with guns is that anybody can make the rifles they're sending into combat. So I said earlier that the M16 is an open source gun. Anybody can make it, and anybody can make parts for it. Anybody can bid on contracts to make it or parts or support for the government. Those 5 companies have all made M16s and successfully sold them to DoD. One of them sticks out to me as somebody who's not primarily known for making firearms, and I won't tell you which one. I will tell you which one. It's General Motors.
There's a big one on there that's missing, IBM.
Yeah, there's a few missing on here. Also, I was looking for a list of people who sold to DoD, not to all branches of government. So if you expand that to all federal law enforcement as well, the list gets really big really quickly. And also, I think I've missed some that have happened since I made this slide. The slide's about a year old, and I think somebody else started selling M16s to DoD last year. You'll see a similar thing to this to M4s. M4s were sole sourced for a while, so the list won't be quite as expansive, and the M4 is considerably newer. Also, there was some patent and trademark issues with the M4 for a while that resulted in a lot of companies making M4s they don't call M4s, or making almost an M4 but missing a couple of parts. But since now the specification is open and the patents are expired and the trademark has returned to the public domain, you don't have that problem anymore. And you have lots of people making M4s. And then since the sole source contract ended, you have lots of people with incentives to make M4s if they're trying to sell them with DoD. Other branches of federal law enforcement, again, weren't really hamstrung by that sole source contract. So you see M4s being sold by other companies to other federal groups besides DoD. So the issue of lock-in is important, but it means you can't get the level of help you need when you need it. The military, when they procure guns, they get people, train them up on how to use them, and deploy them so that when something breaks, you don't have to have Colt fly somebody out to fix it for you, because that's not going to happen. So instead, you have to have somebody that's already trained to tear it apart, find the bug, fix the bug, put it back together, and get it back in combat. What does that sound like? So I also am fond of saying that there's no tech support in a gunfight, just like there's no crying in baseball. So also, sometimes you get vendors that suck. And my favorite example of that is ink cartridges, because they use this sort of, we're going to give them the razor and charge them extra for the blades sort of mentality that is not fun to be on the receiving end of. So can you imagine if Colt tried that same gimmick with an AR-15 and said, here's a really cheap gun, really expensive consumable parts that you need to constantly be buying more of every year. That's not going to work really well. And so DoD found an open source way of getting around that, and they're using a NATO-designed magazine that is standard. And when I say standard, I mean it's completely standardized, will fit any NATO-issued 5.56 rifle. And I'm not talking about just US-issued. If you find yourselves in a foxhole with your NATO friend over here, his mags fit your gun, even if he doesn't have the same kind of gun, even if he doesn't speak the same language, even if he doesn't work for the same people. If he's on the same side, he needs to be able to use the same consumables. And that's why we need open source for saving lives. I will say some NATO-issued rifles do require an adapter to take the standard magazine, although those are readily available. So you also have some firearm manufacturers that still try the ink cartridge thing, not quite as egregiously. The more expensive magazine that's up here on the right is made by Sig, and they were really proud of it at the time. They were $50 proud of it, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's just a little spendy. So open source comes and solves that problem for us. That patent is long expired, so a third-party company comes along and makes a better magazine. And it's equally reliable. It takes 3 extra rounds, and it costs less than half as much. So you would think that would really offend that original manufacturer, and they try to shut that down. It doesn't. They like it a lot. They like it so much they sell it as a factory part now. So that's sort of the magic of open source and guns. Sort of as a vendor lock-in roundup, being able to use open source means that you can get out from under your vendor's thumb, at least a little bit. You don't have to use the same vendor for maintenance and support that you bought the code from, and you can find a vendor for maintenance and support for code you didn't buy. You may have downloaded your code from the Apache website, but there's still a vendor out there that's there to help you with that. You also don't have to give up on a solution just because the manufacturer gave up on it. So for instance, if you took one of those General Motors assault rifles, which by the way are still around, and tried to take it back to General Motors and said, hey man, this broke, I need some tech support, they would probably laugh at you and then call security because there was a guy with a gun walking around in the lobby. And, well, it is broken, right? Well, they don't know that. But we're not dependent on GM to fix that, right? Because there's all those other companies that are happy to make parts for it, and there's way more companies that make parts for it than what I showed you that just haven't sold a complete rifle to DoD. DoD, having been around for more than 200 years, has to be aware of the fact that when they buy something, they're going to last longer than the vendor does. The average age of an M16 that's still in service in DoD is 26 years, which means half of them are older than that. So trusting that your vendor is still going to be around for the next 26 years is kind of a hard call. But trusting that you can get support from it for somebody else is an easy choice and makes open source a lot more attractive. Sort of a hot wash for this part of the slide deck. Open source with software, just like open source with guns, is about keeping you in the fight. It's about keeping you from getting locked in, and it's about keeping you from getting screwed. So shifting gears a little bit to policy. I had to add this slide. I wasn't expecting to get asked quite as often as I did, hey, military open source, that's an oxymoron, right? And the answer is no, it's not. I even put it on the slide. But 15 years ago, that probably was an oxymoron. And so talking about how we get from, yeah, there's no way we can't do open source and military, to where we are now, where it's a fairly good environment for open source, took a lot of work. And I'm going to talk about the work that it took here for this next little bit. So this slide is sort of a timeline of some of the major policy documents that have been part of getting open source used within DoD. And I'll talk about them one at a time. Before I get into that, I want to comment the two on the top left, actually top right because you guys are facing towards it. I always try to get my left and right mixed up at least once in every talk I do. So now I've checked that box and I don't have to worry about that anymore. But the two on the top right were written with authors that are included in our steering committee. So MilOSS steering committee members are listed in the author of those two documents. They are the Open Technology Development Roadmap and then an update to it. The most recent update came out last year. Those documents, if you've ever read Carl Fogel's Producing Open Source Software, it's sort of a DoD-focused update to that. Fogel's work is quoted heavily in it. If you haven't read Fogel's Producing OSS, you need to be reading it because it's fantastic. It's an important document that really shows how to avoid the pitfalls of working in open source and on producing an open source software project or converting a proprietary software to open source. What's up? Fogel. So the first document on that list is the MITRE business case paper, and it sometimes gets overlooked when talking about OSS and DoD, because there was another paper that came out of MITRE shortly thereafter, which is a much bigger, more important landmark paper. But this one was one of the things that started to help get the ball rolling. In 2001, MITRE released a document talking about the business case for using open source, including at DoD. And it gave us this nice little quote: OSS is a viable long-term solution that merits careful consideration because of the potential for significant cost, reliability, and support advantages. That's awesome, and we love to see that kind of thing in print. And they gave us 5 steps for determining when to start considering OSS for use in DoD. The first one was to look at the community that's supporting it. So you're looking for big, well-established communities that are growing. So think like Linux and Apache, groups that aren't going anywhere. The next thing is to look at the market share. If there's a demand for that product, even if the distributor or even if the developer goes away, the product won't go away. Because in open source, we don't like to let that happen. If we're all dependent on something and some guy drops off the project, somebody else steps up. So looking at the market share can be as important as looking at the size of the developer community. The next thing is look at the cost and benefit analysis of using this particular open source project. And that's something you should be doing anytime you're doing procurement, regardless of whether it's software or guns or open source or proprietary. And then compare the long-term costs, because a lot of times people get focused on the upfront costs, and sometimes open source may be more expensive because it requires sort of transitioning away from a locked-in solution. Sometimes it may be a lot cheaper because you're getting software at no cost. But generally in the long term, it starts becoming cheaper because the support contracts may be a little bit cheaper. And then choose your strategy and stick to it. This is the paper that really eclipses the first MITRE paper. This is the MITRE survey. It was part of MITRE's ongoing research into OSS at DoD. And it really, this is important because this put to bed this notion that open source has no place at DoD. A guy at MITRE, asked by DoD, by the name of Terry Bollinger, sent an email to everybody with a .mil email address and said, hey, what kind of open source are you using? And instead of getting the answer that you would get if you ask this question now, which is probably, yeah, we don't comment on software for operational security reasons, people were happy to share with him what they were using. And he found 115 examples of open source in 251 use cases just at DoD. So the examples are available publicly. The use cases, when it gets specific, are distributed as a separate document that wasn't released to the general public for security concerns. But this is a great paper. Check it out. But think about that. 115 examples of open source in 251 use cases in 2001. What open source projects were you using in 2001? I know it wasn't Firefox because it was still called Phoenix. It hadn't even become Firebird yet, and it was still 3 years away from a 1.0 release. So hearing at that time that not only was DoD using open source, but that it was using it in mission critical applications and was dependent on it, was a big wake-up call to DoD, because then all of a sudden it wasn't, we need to stop using open source, it was we need to find out what's right about open source that's resulting in us using it even when we're not sure we're on board with it. Please.
It would be interesting to take a look at that snapshot now and see out of that list of programs what's still being used, because that's a big drawback of open source is continual development from the open source community. Look at how many Linux distros have been created. Really cool distros, and they just fall off. Nobody supports them.
So I got to do an update of that sort. I couldn't do a direct survey because people don't want to talk about it, but I was able to look at what was publicly documented and found that a large percentage of the software that he identified is still in use. A big part of that is because he wasn't talking about distributions, he was talking about individual tools. So something like bind is not going anywhere because we still need DNS really badly. You know, something like Apache is not going anywhere. It also only called out like Linux and then BSD first and then distributions rather than focusing on individual things that go away more easily. What's up?
So instead of the use of free and open source, stuff that's on repos on it, right? What about the in-house developed open source products that aren't actually open outside of the military, but aren't considered closed source because the source code is available?
So that's usually, and I'll get to that. I will. Those are usually referred to as government off-the-shelf software, and the source code may be available internally but not externally, but I have information about that. The other thing is that an update of sorts was done by DHS as part of the Homeland Open Security Technology Program. It was focused on federal government as a whole, not on just DoD, so that may be something worth checking out as far as what's an updated snapshot looking like. But you can also get the list and just tell from looking at it, oh yeah, this is all still relevant software.
But you're talking about stuff that is open source that everybody uses. We're not talking about open source stuff that the military created to be used in the military. This is not military created software. This is open source software that the military procured and was using that they got from somebody else. I mean, I would count that as a list.
I mean, everybody uses bind, right? I get on the internet sometimes. The other thing is not only is bind being used, but bind is being used in a critical way. Because if you take bind away, then you have a real hard time. What's up?
I was thinking an interesting thing that you might want to do is do a survey of who uses O'Reilly Safari Works Online. That would be, we get free accounts on that.
I bet O'Reilly has that information, and I bet they don't want to share it. Because then that's a hunting list for everybody else. So talking about policy changes that sort of followed as a direct result of the MITRE study. The MITRE study opens everybody's eyes, and then policy starts shifting as a result of it. And the MITRE study really sets the course of the policy changes to come. And the first big policy change is what we call the Stenbit memo, named after John Stenbit, former DoD CIO and former Assistant Secretary of Defense. And in it, he says that open source software meets the DoD's definition of commercial software, which is critical because until that point, people had this perception that open source meant non-commercial. And the DoD has procurement guidelines for getting commercial off-the-shelf software and no procurement guidelines for getting non-commercial software and discourages getting non-commercial software. But the DoD's definition of what commercial means is that it has been sold or licensed or been offered for sale or license to the public at some point. So it's really hard to find an open source project that doesn't meet that definition. But
The Senate tried to shut that down as an open source project, and they gave it to the open source community.
was it not licensed?
Well, as they created it, it was meant to be open source big data product, and Congress stepped in and said that it was such a good product that it created unfair competition to those that were selling products to DoD. They were trying to shut it down.
Which part of it?
Accumulo. It's been in the news. It was a big sting with open source stuff that they actually did a really thing.
Okay.
Did they fork it, the NSA forked it and use their own version of it?
I think they spun out a company, actually.
It was basically their version of big data, the tape group. So, and they wanted to implement, it was a very successful, implement security at a cell level in big data, right? And they were going to implement this across all government agencies because it is a great secure product and it was developed in-house. Congress stepped in and said, this is open source, this is unfair competition from Dell and HP and all these other companies that have big data products. It's unfair, and we're not going to let it happen.
So Dell stepped in.
If I can make a quick vote, I'd like to continue that discussion with beer later. But for right now, let's kind of get back. But yeah, so this idea that open source software was commercial software is what sort of kicked in the door and let open source start seeing use within DoD. Also, going back for a second, the Stenbit memo in 2003, as far as I can tell, was the first government document to talk about the use of open source in the procurement policy. Every couple of years, somebody thinks that they've created this new open source thing. Like in 2010, the city of San Francisco announced how it had the first government policy about open source, but they were a few years late for that. They just, didn't get to the library often enough. So the Office of Management and Budget issued a memo in 2004 titled Software Acquisition that sort of did the same thing for the federal government as a whole rather than just for within DoD, and made the same statement about open source being commercial software and following the same rules. The DON CIO guidance, Department of Navy Chief Information Officer, was titled Department of the Navy Open Source Guidance, and is another big landmark piece on open source within DoD. And I'm actually going to read for it for just a second because I think some of this is awesome. But a big quote was, "The misconception that OSS is neither a commercial off-the-shelf nor government off-the-shelf solution has hindered DON's ability to leverage the benefits of OSS methodology. Because of this misconception, OSS has not received equal consideration during the software acquisition process." And then it goes on to say that when procuring open source software, you need to make sure that you abide by the terms of its license agreement, which is cool for another reason, because it was one of the first documents to give legs to the GPL and say, hey, look, the government's following this too. You know, it's about the enforceability of the GPL.
Wasn't the Navy already using at least Tor and stuff like that? I feel like the Navy was an earlier adopter than that Navy.
Yeah, that wasn't the thing that opened the door to the use of Navy within open source within the Navy. It was the thing that changed the policy and made it easy for in the future for people to continue using open source within the Navy.
Open source software in the Navy to lower punch bones.
Right.
Among the fleet, basically.
It's
Right.
heavily siloed too, so Navy does things, the Army doesn't do, the Army doesn't.
Right, okay. So this is them telling everyone, like, yes, we're down, but they're already doing it.
Well, you also need to understand from the context that even though OSS was being used within certain parts of the Navy or within certain parts of the DoD, it's a huge organization, and not everybody knows what everybody else is doing. And a top-down memo ensures that all of a sudden people are up to date on what the policy means, because the policy never prohibited the use of open source, right? It had a misconception that it did. And these update the misconception and say, hey guys, you should be using this. There's really good reasons to be doing so. The most recent, in terms of DoD, sort of memo on this topic is the Wintergren memo, which supersedes and replaces the 2003 Stimbit memo. And I'm going to talk about it for a couple of slides, actually. But the first thing it said is open source is COTS, commercial off the shelf. It's that same statement that we keep seeing over and over again that becomes really important in the procurement process. The next thing it said was that open source needs to be included in the market research that's done when you're procuring software. DoD is required to do market research when procuring software, and now they're required to include open source as part of that process to identify when they could be using open source. It also, and this is great because always good to have good press, always good to have good press written by the DoD CIO, was a list of benefits of open source according to DoD. The first thing was that the source code peer review, like when you have the code out in the public and people can argue about it endlessly, you get a pretty good feel for whether it's going to be secure and reliable because people are running it and they're finding problems with it and they're fixing the problems. The next thing is that when the DoD gets the ability to change its own software, if the mission changes, the software can change with it. Whereas if they're locked into software they can't modify, they don't have that option. They also get that reduced vendor lock-in that I love to talk about. Because open source licenses don't really restrict who can use the code, how they can use the code, where they can use the code. When you need a project, you can get open source really, really quickly. I know personally, I've used an open source solution for something that I could have used a proprietary solution for just because I didn't have to wait until I could buy the proprietary solution. Not even a budget concern, a timing concern. I can make open source happen right now. The lack of per seat licensing, and some open source projects do have per seat licensing, but generally it doesn't, and if it does, it's not quite as expensive as using a proprietary solution. DoD is able to share the maintenance costs, and they can either share it among DoD. You can have a lot of groups within DoD using the same software and all benefiting from maintenance that they're doing with each other, or within the federal government, other groups within the government can be using it, or with commercial users, or with the community. And then rapid prototyping. So if you need a solution right now, and you don't know exactly what it looks like, but you can use open source to find out. Because this open source, let's just download it off the web and run it, is kind of the ultimate free trial, because it doesn't expire. And then you can modify it to fit what you need the prototype to look like. Here was some of the guidance that was attached to that. The first is that you have to use the software that best fits the need, regardless of its license, which in my opinion is a big win for open source, because open source wasn't seeing quite as much use within DoD as it's been seeing since then, because now the license isn't as relevant as what fits the mission the best. Also, and this is cool, the prohibitions against using code without much support options were found to not apply to open source. Because just because there's not a support option available for it doesn't mean it can't be supported. You can procure open source and then support it yourself because you have access to that code. So you can have someone get trained on the software, learn how to use it, learn how to do their own tech support, and learn how to make their own updates, bug fixes, enhancements, modifications. No software should be used without support, which is someplace where open source really shines because you don't have to use the same vendor for support that you bought the code from, and you don't maybe have to use a vendor for open source support at all. You may be able to do the support yourself, as was previously mentioned. And that using open source doesn't trap the government. There was a lot of fear once upon a time about the GPL, that maybe if you use code that's GPL'd, you're going to be forced to give back anything you do to it. Well, no, the GPL doesn't say that. What it says is that if you distribute the software, you have to also distribute the code. But if I download something and I say, oh, I really need this fix real quick, and I do it, nobody has a gun to my head and says, now you must commit that back up on SourceForge, because that's not how the license works. And that open source should be shared. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say that maybe everyone's been around that 2007 memo actually came to visit the FSF office.
Cool.
To come and hang out and talk. This is the only time anyone in the office had ever put on a shirt with a collar. It was kind of exciting. So yeah, I think they really wanted to make sure they totally understood, and so it was like all the licensing people from the office, and it's like, yes, what's the job of the US Navy? Yeah, they had questions, but they got answers.
Well, that's awesome. Problems need solutions. And then the last big win was that open source needs to be shared. So if the DoD is procuring open source, as big of an organization as DoD is, it's a good chance somebody else in DoD needs the same software. So start sharing that as widely as possible. And that actually fits in with Forge.mil, which came out around this time, which is the DoD's means of sharing source code within itself, both for things that they've procured and for things they've developed themselves, or for updates they've added to other projects. Now, an awesome thing that was included at the tail end of the Wintergreen memo was, when does DoD release open source software? The 2009 memo encouraged DoD to start making open source software releases under certain circumstances. And the first one sounds a little Machiavellian because it's when it's to the government's advantage. However, the example that they called out is that it is to the government's advantage to have as many users of their software as possible, because more users mean that they're finding bugs and filing bug fixes. And more users with the source code means that those bug fixes have patches attached to them, which is greatly to DoD's advantage. The next big requirement is that the government actually has the right to distribute the code, which almost always is the case because work produced for the government becomes the government's property. But occasionally, there's some edge cases where contractors are involved that may wind up with partial ownership of the code. And there's some attachments that talk about how to get around those situations and still make releases. And then the last step is that the release of the software can't be prohibited by law, which is kind of a no-brainer. And they talk about specifically with export controls, where you might have something that's ITAR controlled and you can't release outside the US. So basically, DoD has to follow the same rules as everybody else. Rootkits?
Military weapons grade weaponized software.
Yeah, I've never found one of those on GitHub. I mean, at least not with their name on it. So this slide is something that I took from our website. This is from our policy section. Our website has a lot of policy resources, also a lot of licensing resources. All of these on the website come with links, so you can get links directly to these documents we're talking about. So that's sort of where we were. Here's where we are now. And this screen grab I took yesterday evening, and it gives me a warm fuzzy because it is on defense.gov. And it's not buried deep within defense.gov. It's dodcio.defense.gov/open source software FAQ. And this is the current guidance on using open source within the military. So while that gives me a warm fuzzy, not as much as the last question in the FAQ, which, in case you can't read it, is where do OSS developers congregate and what conferences should I go to? And Mil-OSS is mentioned by name twice in there, so that's awesome. So when you start finding open source policy being discussed, you'll probably find people from Mil-OSS involved. Our guys love policy, they love talking about policy, and they love being involved in policy, especially open source policy. Most of the documents we've talked about have had somebody from Mil-OSS involved in the process, at least to some extent. So if you come by the booth, you've seen our stickers that say, OSS is here. Note the present tense. With defense.gov talking about open source in a big FAQ, like, it's time for open source. To paraphrase Victor Hugo, nothing is as powerful as an idea whose time has come. And open source is here, its time is here, and it's not going anywhere. And you can tell this, go to a Linux user group meeting, right? Like, years ago, when we went to lug meetings, we talked about, man, I really can't get this thing installed. And I really can't figure out how to get sound support working with this laptop at all, ever. Now, if you go to a lug meeting, the lug's either gone because nobody needs support anymore. They can pick up the phone and get support. Or if the lug's still around, they're talking about cool stuff beyond just here's how you get software on your computer. Because they've had to change because we're here. Open source is here, Linux is here, it's not going anywhere. So getting it on your computer is not an interesting topic anymore. I mean, so my parents are not computer people, and they couldn't tell you what an Apache server is, but they have an opinion about XFCE versus GNOME 3. So that, for me, is the benchmark for when open source is here. So hopefully I've gotten at least some of you guys marginally interested in what we're doing, and you're wondering how you can participate. So the last couple of minutes here, I'm going to talk about that. The first thing is that membership is open to everybody. We don't have any kind of checks. There's no nationality requirement. It doesn't matter where you're from, what country you live in. Hop on our mailing list. There's no fee. We are an organization where you're as involved as you want to be. So if all you want to do is get a weekly digest of our emails as a way of checking out, hey, here's something cool that's changed in OSS with DoD, that's cool. If you want to get really involved in the conversation, that's really cool too. Maybe you're more into the meat space kind of meetups. In different regions, we have weekly, monthly drinks, lunch, dinner, whatever, where we talk about these types of things. If we don't have something in your region, feel free to start one. Nobody's standing in your way. We try to follow a very open source principle that we lead by doing. So if you want to get involved, don't wait for somebody to ask you for help. Just get up and do something awesome. Along that vein, we've started a chapters initiative within MilOSS. We had our first chapter start up a couple of years ago in Charleston. Yes. You know who doesn't have a chapter? Charlotte. You know who needs to start that chapter? You do. Say what? Well, we don't have a chapter in Raleigh yet either. So these chapters are sort of the first ones that we got started. We have more coming out regularly. And the chapters are just like an individual. You're as involved as you want to be. So if your chapter wants to get together and have beer once a month, that's a great chapter event, and I want to go to that. If your chapter wants to have a massive conference, that's also a great chapter event, and I want to go to that too. So it's up to the chapter how involved they want to be, what they want to do, and what an event looks like for them. I think our only requirement for what a chapter does is they have at least 2 events of some description in their first 2 years of operation. So, I mean, you can get a bunch of guys together with pizza at least twice, probably pretty quickly. So, last I have my shameless plug. We have an upcoming event in Charleston, and I heard people go, woo, a minute ago, so I expect to see you all there. It's our annual working group. It's merging with a chapter event that was being held there last year. We've decided to have our annual working group start floating around to our chapters so that we start seeing different faces every year at the event and start getting more exposure and focus on the great work that our chapters are doing. So we're starting that with Charleston. It's August 6th through 8th. So if you're looking for when that is, it's right before Flock. And hopefully I'll see you all there. Here's my contact information. If you want to ask questions, I'm at my booth. I'm on the emails. I have Twitter. I rarely use it, so I didn't include it. I mean, I'm happy to follow other people on Twitter, but like logging in is something that seems like a lot of work for me, so. Although if you have a plugin to use Twitter from within Thunderbird, I want to know about it.
How many military-related responses can you type into 140 characters?
Probably a lot, because everybody uses acronyms. Well, that's true, and unpronounceable too. The unpronounceable ones are the best because it's like, oh, have you tried? Anyway, so that's all I have. Thank you all for coming out.
When we created Asterisk over a decade ago, we could not have imagined that Asterisk would not only become the most widely adopted open source communication software on the planet, but that it would impact the entire industry in the way that it has. Today, Asterisk has found its way into more than 170 countries and virtually every Fortune 1000 company.
The success of Asterisk has enabled a transition of power from the hands of the traditional proprietary phone vendors into the hands of the users and the administrators of phone systems. Using this power, our customers have created all sorts of business-changing applications, from small office phone systems to mission-critical call centers to international carrier networks. In fact, there's even an entire country whose communications infrastructure runs on Asterisk.
Digium has always been about creating technology that expands communications capabilities in ways that we could never have imagined. And that's part of what's game-changing about Digium. Today, we're doing it again, this time by introducing a new family of HD IP phones that extends control of the user all the way to the desktop.
The launch of these new products represents the next phase in Digium's history of innovation. These are the first and only IP phones designed to fully leverage the power of Asterisk. When we first discussed our expectations for building a family of phones for use with Asterisk, our requirements were pretty simple. We asked the team to build the phones such that they were easy to install, integrate, provision, and use. I think you'll soon agree our engineers have delivered on that goal. User feedback is validating that when it comes to operation with Asterisk-based systems, including our own SwitchVox-based product, these are the easiest to use, best integrated, most interoperable products on the market today. The Digium family of phones will initially include 3 IP desk phones, uniquely designed to complement any Asterisk or SwitchVox-based solution. These phones are different for a number of reasons. First, they're exclusively designed for use with Asterisk. Secondly, we've made it really easy to auto-discover and provision the phones. Next, we've made it easy for the phones to access information inside of Asterisk, allowing tight coupling between an application and the phone. Additionally, we've created an applications engine that allows users and developers to create and run their own apps on the phone. And finally, we've done all of this at a very compelling price point. At Digium, we're always thinking of ways to give our customers the best value in business phone systems and also give them the power to create their own solutions for any communications challenge.
We'll continue to push the boundaries, not only to make Asterisk cooler, faster, and more technologically feature-rich, but to make Asterisk and VoIP communications even easier.
And together, we'll change the way the world communicates.
Again.
Your customers rely on your website or application. If it's slow or non-responsive, it infuriates your users and costs you money. Keeping your business-critical systems humming along requires insight into what they're doing. Your system metrics tell stories that can reveal performance bottlenecks, resource limitations, and other problems. But how do you keep an eye on all of your system's performance metrics in real time and record this data for later analysis? Enter Longview, the new way to see what's really going on under the hood. The Longview dashboard lets you visualize the status of all your systems, providing you with a bird's-eye view of your entire fleet. You can sort by CPU, memory, swap, processes load, and network usage. Click a specific system to access its individual dashboard, then click and drag to zoom in on choke points and get more detail. Comprehensive network data, including inbound and outbound traffic, is available on the Network tab, and disk writes and free space on the Disks tab, while the Process Explorer displays usage statistics for individual processes. The System Info tab shows listening services, active connections, and available updates. Adding Longview to a system is easy. Just click the button, copy the one-line installation command, then run the command on your Linux system to complete the process. The agent will begin collecting data and sending it to Longview. Then the graphs start rolling. Use Longview to gain visibility into your servers, so when your website or app heats up, it stays up.
Most enterprises today realize that usernames and passwords alone aren't enough to keep their network safe from unauthorized intrusions. That's why two-factor authentication has gotten so popular lately. It adds that extra layer of protection enterprise networks need to stay safe. But what you may not know is that some two-factor authentication solutions, they're better than others, like two-factor strong authentication with Wicked. Wicked goes beyond other authentication systems by being less expensive, easier to implement, and easier to use, giving you software-based token clients built to run on all major devices and OSs, including iOS and Android. These tokens utilize a public-private key combination that's generated on device, so there aren't any shared secrets flying around for attackers to hijack, or which require any special handling. Instead, all keys are kept secure and private between the requesting token and your server, which you control in-house, making it the most secure way possible to perform authentication encryption. And with an extensive, flexible API and support for protocols like LDAP and Radius, Wicked works with any enterprise network architecture to protect the IT systems vital to your enterprise. Download your Wicked free trial today, regardless of whether you're considering two-factor authentication for the first time or just ready to ditch your existing expensive key fob system. We can help with easy-to-implement, easy-to-use, strong authentication. From Wicked.
Cloud stacks are everywhere.
This is the way to better utilize all your resources, and it makes managing all your resources pretty easy.
All of the innovation is happening in open source.
The collaborative nature and of the community and the speed at which these deficiencies, these bugs are getting discovered and fixed is a thing that really shows the power of the open source community.
It is global, and it's definitely because of the users.
Community people are extremely friendly and always ready to help.
If you go onto IRC any day, you'll see these guys helping each other out, and they're all doing it like in a selfless manner.
The product is transparent for everyone. Everyone can look at the code base. Everyone can see how CloudStack is being built. Nothing is proprietary. Everything is open.
In many ways, it's absolutely vital to the ongoing health of CloudStack.
The most exciting event in recent memory for me was our first developer boot camp. And our call gave people, I think, maybe 2 weeks notice to come attend. I was expecting 25 or 30 people. So we ended up with 87 people and had to go get more chairs into the room twice.
Everything within cloud computing is commodity and is open source. And so I don't think that you'll see anywhere where open source is not pervasive in cloud computing. And so I think it's an assumption. I think when you talk about cloud computing, you're really talking about open source cloud computing.
CloudStack is a robust solution for large deployments.
You have dozens of data centers and thousands of servers in each data center. Hardware is going to fail, and CloudStack is designed to handle, number one, that mass scale. Number two, it's designed to handle the failure that inevitably happens in large deployments.
We started working on CloudStack over 4 years ago, and it was the original set of people working on it had a background of delivering software to telcos and service providers.
Lots of QA, lots of users actually using it.
High availability is the key feature. Multiple hypervisor support, different network models. You can pick up whatever suits you better.
CloudStack management server can be deployed in different physical machines.
It definitely has a huge footprint. It's being deployed everywhere.
There's a major movie studio that they were using CloudStack. They were using it to transcode video, and I thought that was terribly fascinating. What I found more fascinating is what they did during lunch. where they would spin up, 50 or 60 game servers. Then as soon as lunch was over, they would destroy all the instances and go back to doing real work.
CloudStack is vast. It touches so many different aspects, and there's no one person that's kind of like a master of all those realms.
I think CloudStack as a project is going to be one of the leaders simply because it's some of the most featureful and robust platforms out there.
I don't see any limits to the CloudStack.